and good evening,
Toby, hello.
and welcome, Toby, to
Yep.
Two Big Egos in a Small Car.
Charles, we need to rename it Marxism Today for this episode.
We do. That's a whole new title. And welcome to Toby Manning,
Be more
author. We're
popular.
delighted, Toby, that you're with us this evening. And tonight we're looking at Toby's book, Toby Manning's book, 2024 rather, published by Repeater Books. That's Repeater Books, Mixing Pop and Politics, a Marxist history of popular music.
Come on.
And that's quite something to consider. A book that is in length, 566 pages, and no pictures. And so that's quite some work to get through. It's obviously a dictionary pretty much of music as political theory, and a serious matter and a serious heavyweight subject. I'm going to start, Toby, by
It's not
asking.
hard to read though, Charles. It's not an academic text. It's
No,
pretty entertaining.
no, absolutely. But I guess the first question to ask, this couldn't be a broader question, Toby, by any means, is why write the book?
Because I didn't think such a book existed, I guess. That there isn't really anything that systematically situates music in its sort of historical context in any meaningful way in relationship to anything other than the other music that was being created at the time. So we hear plenty about waves of genres, and there might be a sort of wave of the hand at something else that was happening at the same time. But it's very rare to actually dig down deep into that and really see the way in which everything from the choices of words to sounds to phrases to images are somehow reflecting what's sort of going on in society at that moment. That's what I'm trying to get at, I suppose.
Absolutely, and I mean, I can see that. I mean, you're right. Many a book doesn't look in those terms. I guess the question is why actually other books have not done that. I mean, because if pop culture represents everything around it and absorbs everything around it, it's fair to assume that actually politics does have an implication on that. And indeed, the types of politics that exist in any country at any time, the implications behind that. I mean, I guess we can look at punk perhaps as being a political time for music. And I guess there are certain writers that we can think of, Billy Bragg, Elvis Costello, whatever that would have, the Specials or whatever that would apply to. But in terms actually of then looking at it as you have, it's something that hasn't been looked at in the detail perhaps that it warrants, not to the extent of a book of 566 pages, for example.
You are including the index there, which is probably about 100 pages. To be fair to myself.
Yeah.
I mean, it still feels like an incredible speed through things to me. Yeah, I mean, your questions and statements. I couldn't put it better myself. Really, that's
Yeah.
exactly. I think well, why wouldn't it be related to what's going on in the world? And as you say, punk is a fairly easy one where punk and maybe the sort of the sort of folk protest movement is a
Yeah.
sort of early Dylan and stuff like that. Those are easy to see the ways in which they're political. They often talk very explicitly about politics, and they're generally accepted as political. Though I think they're accepted as something of a kind of anomaly in a way. I think that my theory is broadly that there's a sort of desire to separate culture and society. And to sort of look particularly at music actually as being just almost just in aesthetic terms or or sometimes more in biographical terms. So it's just about the sort of self-expression and therefore the life of the artist. And I mean, I did a lot of that myself. I was a music journalist. So, I spent a lot of time in the company of artists, and it was very clear. I mean, I was interested, but it was very clear that my editor's main interest was in, gossip, the kind of like sort of interesting biographical tidbits, how this sort of related to the music and stuff. So one of the things I've done in this book, which I think is relatively unusual, I don't think I've quoted a single musician throughout it. And I take relatively little interest, not just in what they say, but relatively little in what they do, unless it really leaps out. So like Mick Jagger going to an anti-Vietnam demonstration at Grosvenor Square. That is a moment when the sort of artist's life come into it. But yeah, so I thought, what if we actually just treat the musicians as sort of vessels, just a bit like I would actually say that for all its flaws, the new Bob Dylan biopic does. You don't know anything really about the mystery, the enduring mystery that remains Bob Dylan, and kind of all the better for it. I don't want to find out what the core is in a way. I want the mystery to remain.
I think he remains a complete unknown, doesn't he? I mean, I think that's
exactly. I mean, so the film is quite accurately titled, and I think to its credit, it doesn't really try to sort of unravel him. It sort of presents him as a conduit of what's going on, but that he might not even understand fully himself the way, what he's expressing and why, so I think that's the incredible thing about Dylan. He just had, a finger on the pulse is a cliche, but somehow he was just expressing what was going on in this incredibly sort of visionary way.
Right. There's about three amazing things about this book amongst that are fundamental to it, amongst many other things that are amazing. The first thing is that although it quotes Guy Debord and Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno, it also covers the lyrics and the chart positions and the years of a huge amount of pop and rock and rap tracks and dance tracks from the mid-50s to the present day. It's a potted, really detailed musical biography of how the landscape for music's changed. But at the same time, every single track, even when the artists themselves didn't realize they're being political or social or cultural, you managed to find in all the lyrics and all the songs you're dealing with, and you're dealing with an awful lot of songs, a meaning behind it that reflects the politics of the time. That is just like absolutely revolutionary in an approach to writing about pop history. I can't remember a single book that's done it so well in such detail in that is very readable.
Thank you. Job done in that case. That's if it works, that's great. I mean, I think a lot of people would probably feel like he's reaching, he's stretching. He's like, and of course, that's kind of part of the fun in a way. Yeah. But I also just feel like I found myself always unwilling to accept that anything was gobbledygook, and maybe that's the sort of Freudian in me as much as the Marxist. I kind of think like nothing happens entirely by accident. It's always expressive of something.
The Mark Bolan's lyrics.
Yeah, I mean, they are a challenge to sort of relate politically, but just I mean, the ones I quote tend to be things like they're just full of kind of hippy dippy imagery, aren't they? But in that interesting way. But then also full of kind of, so the wear a big hat and what's that the line that goes in Ride a White Swan. But it's like, and there's stuff about wizards still at that point.
Yeah.
But then he's also got these really kind of modern images about sort of cars, Mustang Fords and Diamond Star hubcaps and stuff like that. So, it's just like he's channeling the sort of shift from those sort of, I don't know, sort of pastoral hippie, get back to the garden sort of 60s era to the sort of harder edged, more urban sound and vision and lyrics and sort of atmosphere of the 70s. Everything, became much more, music became harder sounding, slightly harder in sentiment. And that seems to me to reflect a shift from Love and Peace to something a bit more kind of arsey and ornery that we're seeing in all the strikes and sit-ins and occupations and stuff.
I think, but the reason the book isn't Marxist in the sense that you're not attempting to show that all these many famous pop, rap, dance, rock and roll tunes are Marxist. What you're doing is you're showing that Marx's attitude towards art and culture exists in all these tracks, even the tracks that we're not aware it does, because Marx believed, as you wrote, that the mode of production conditions social, political, and intellectual life. And so mass art is never simply opposed from above. It's like content follows form, culture follows economy. And that's how you've managed to analyze all these very different songs and extract value from them.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. As you say, the approach is Marxist. It's Marxist to be sort of so on top of like the idea of history and the way that history and economics and ideology kind of inform what's going on. I'm not, there will be times I make claim that certain things have resonances with Marxist thought. and that's easier with, I don't know, Billy Bragg, or before mentioned Bob Dylan than it might be with the Carpenters, but I'm still using a Marxist framing and even thinking about it in those terms, because, like, for instance, I went to see Stevie Nicks last summer. And she did a cover version, a perfectly serviceable cover version of Buffalo Springfield's For What It's Worth. And she did a long spiel at the beginning about how the song was misunderstood and it wasn't a political song. Now, I was like, I'm just like, for a start, what? And she quoted Steve Stills, and doubtless he also now feels it's again, I don't take a lot of notice, he's addled in his dotage, but the thing is the specifics of, like, she was saying it's just kids wanting to party. Well, if kids want to party and the authorities come along with nightsticks and, like, crack their heads open, then that is immediately political. Partying becomes political, as it did again later in rave, and these kids were hippies who wanted to change the world, and hedonism and freedom was just part of that. And that was what the authorities were trying to crack down on in every direction.
I like that thought. That rave culture was rebellious, wasn't it? That's its very nature, putting on raves in places that they had no permission to do so. That very thing, going against what's accepted as the norm, actually in itself is a political act, isn't it?
Yeah, I think particularly the timing of rave, which was more or less at the time when all of the modern world's problems were supposed to have been solved. The Cold War had ended, the Berlin Wall had collapsed. Now liberalism was going to, make everybody, happy, basically. And yet a lot of people were still not happy with what was actually on offer, and having to sort of go to some considerable ends to sort of defy police and, cordoned off roads and stuff, to go and, like, let something out, collectively. And I think that's also important. The collectivity in a sort of very individualist age was being reasserted. And just the fact that they wouldn't stop, like that when the authorities said no, they were like, well, no, we're going to do this, So, yeah, I think that's really political. And there was, they didn't have demands. They didn't have a particular, like, program or anything, but I don't think we need that from popular culture particularly, and also I think the left had been to a large extent sort of, destroyed at that point. There wasn't really a left-wing project to align themselves to. And so it was a missed opportunity in a way, that got sort of funneled into other things like commercial clubbing and stuff. But there was this, like, potential of all these people coming together and saying, no, we're not going to do what everyone says,
Graham?
One of the boldest things in the book is that, and I've not seen this in many books about music over the years, is you not only have a go at historians for their interpretation of the past, in terms of people like Dominic Sandbrook and Andy Beckett, you also have a go by name at Simon Reynolds and John Savage and Stuart Maconie and Ian MacDonald about the way they misinterpret the political meaning of the 60s and 70s in particular. And no one else has done that. And the way you interpret those eras, I think, is entirely right, because the 60s did matter. It wasn't just selfish middle-class people having a good time. Glam did matter. It wasn't just a reflection of Britain going down the pan, because I remember the 70s. The working classes had a great time in the 70s. Only if you're rich.
It was the working class decade. It was the working class decade. There was never the same level of sort of confidence and swagger, and therefore activity amongst the working classes,
Yeah.
That's what Thatcher destroyed.
You also say, and you're spot on with this, that punk was not a rejection of social democracy and left-wing ideals. It was a reaction to the fact that the government and politics had abandoned social democracy, which again is spot on. And people like Andy Beckett don't say that. They're part of the whole mainstream right-wing trend of denigrating things which challenged the way things were. They're trying to put it back in its box. They're trying to put all this rebellion into a box they can just forget about.
I've got some time for Andy Beckett. I think he gets a few things wrong. I think that's more the case with John Savage in this instance. And the problem is, I think, with a lot of these people is that they are semi-engaging with politics and socioeconomics and stuff. But I think in a somewhat superficial and a kind of sort of liberally kind of sort of consensus scripted way. So they don't really, I think Andy Beckett does actually go some distance to challenging some of the sort of shibboleths and sort of agreed things about the 70s. But he could still go further. He still has his hand like, oh, unions, too much power. It's a scary working class kind of thing,
Yeah, but to know that this is rubbish, you just have to accept the fact that for a very long time, all Britain's economic woes were blamed on trade unions, but we haven't had real trade union power now for 30 years, and Britain's worse than ever. So
yeah,
it
exactly.
tells you that trade unions weren't the cause.
It doesn't really add up. People talk about the economic chaos of the 70s. Well, if you look at everything from, even inflation wasn't that bad in relative terms, but the deficit, whatever else, growth was actually way better. But everyone was like, panicking about it and blah, blah, blah. So as you say, the proof is in the fact that actually everything has got a whole lot worse. And that, there's no way that you can blame unions because after the miners' strike, they were completely smashed. So,
Yeah.
I always bemoan the fact that I can't think of political pop acts in our current world, and where the hell have they gone, and why are they not around at all? So I mean, the ones I quoted, we're talking some time ago now, the Specials and Billy Bragg and Elvis Costello, and I wonder, because forgive me, unlike Graham, I haven't had the chance to read your book, Toby, so I do wonder where we see politics in pop music in, if you like, in the more recent times. Is it there? Am I just blind to it? Or actually, has it taken some excavation on your part to kind of see that link between politics and pop in a world now that's dominated by pop rather than rock for a start, and by sugary pop acts whose main job is to do little more than promote happiness, joy, and songs about love?
Well, I don't want to knock happiness and joy as an objective, but yeah. I take your point. Remember, I've got this brilliant get out. Like I've got the sort of 5-year-old sort of indefatigable logic that, it's still political, even if it doesn't sound political. Do you know what I mean? So I can always fall back on that as my explanation. What if I were to dig deeper? I think that, in tandem with the sort of a weaker left and a weaker sort of rejection of the political status quo, yes, explicit political content has probably declined in popular music to a certain extent. But by my method, I still find references to it all over the place. And I would say actually that even so, there's still rather more of it than one might think. So like for instance, I dispute Simon Reynolds when he says that grime as a genre is not political. There are quite a lot of political grime. Hip hop is still a pretty political genre. I will always say that grime and hip hop, as the voices of disenfranchised groups, just depicting the everyday reality of those communities is always going to be political. They could be writing about, drug inter gang drug wars. That is still political. But if we want political analysis, there's less of that. But it's still not absent. There are still moments, and like there's a whole. I think you still find it in someone like Kendrick Lamar. There is still analysis there. And I think the other thing that's happened recently is this sort of rebirth. They call it post-punk. It's sort of, it's a sort of neo-post-punk. It's in some ways closer to punk than post-punk. But, and they're not pure revivalists. So I'm talking about bands like the Idols and Fontaine's DC and Yard Act and Wet Leg. Yeah. They're not
pure... Even English teacher commenting on things. English teacher.
I would include English Teacher in this gang and Kneecap. Neither of them are strictly post-punk, but they're young bands and they're quite political. And they've sort of, they're working in this sort of, Kneecap are more hip hop, but working in a sort of guitar band format. But they're bringing in lots of things like hip hop, and even in Fontaine's case, some like Irish folk and stuff. So that's radical sort of pogsy kind of like, sort of tradition. So and they parade with Palestinian flags, and they make very outspoken comments and stuff, and their lyrics political. So I think it's still there. You just have to look a bit harder beyond the sort of obvious. Actually, there are even some quite, there were two American number one hits in 2023 that were real kind of MAGA reactionary things. So this is the other thing, like we think be political, we just might not like their politics,
Yeah.
But, there was Try That in a Small Town by James Aldean, which was a really nasty anti-Black Lives Matter type song, sort of threatening to shoot anybody that was anti-conformist, essentially. And there was Oliver Anthony's Rich Men, North of Richmond, which, was like, sort of sounded potentially like it was radical and it was sort of against the elite, but it was very much doing that thing of like having a go at people on welfare and stuff, and people who are obese and stuff like that, just like blaming the kind of victims of the system,
Yeah.
Graham. You can just as well analyze Taylor Swift. You could write a book about Taylor Swift. Is Taylor Swift a feminist or not a feminist? Is she left of centre in any way whatsoever, or is she right wing? You could write a whole book on that. And she doesn't think she's a political artist, but she is. She can't help it. You can't help being political, even if you're not aware of it. And that's what your book shows, which is why it covers everything so well.
Thank you. Well, yeah, exactly. I think Taylor Swift is a great example. Sometimes, like you say, she can kind of sound at least sort of, left liberal and sort of like, and quite sort of feistily feminist. And at other times, she kind of sounds like she's just sort of channeling the sort of individualist zeitgeist, like on "Look What You Made Me Do," and stuff like that. And
I think she's Tammy Wynette for the 21st century. She's married or goes out with a quarterback in American football. She dresses like a country singer. She's totally capitalist. Like she makes loads of money out of all her tours.
Yeah.
So in some ways, she's just a country star for the modern era.
Yeah, but she's got that massive like pop crossover. So but the thing is, and I mean, my thing about Taylor Swift is she's full of songs about like, I'm nice and good and you were a complete dick to me. Like it's always somebody else's fault, It's not like, well,
every man
or whatever, she's having a go at Kanye West. She's always the poor innocent victim. And I do think that channels something that I would call political, which is a sort of attitude now where, people, are so kind of like atomized, they can't really take responsibility and they just, all the bad stuff is done by other people.
But I agree with that. But as you know, Rolling Stones lyrics in the mid-'60s in particular,
under my thumb,
had a lot of denigrating remarks about women. So perhaps it's just like women getting their own back all these years later.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. Yeah. I mean, the other thing is like almost everything is dialectic. This is the other great kind of like, thing that you can't argue with that from Marx, just like, because as soon as you say it's dialectic, well, it can be a bit of this, a bit of that, and they kind of they speak to each other. So yeah, the Rolling Stones, like what are the Rolling Stones? Are they conservative or are they radical? And the truth is at certain times from song to song, from album to album, they can be one or the other. And I think the same is true of someone like Taylor Swift. That's why that's why it's fascinating because, people express all sorts of different currents that are in society at the moment, not necessarily just one kind of like, sort of staid, sort of strict view.
It's also a case that with the lyric, once it's in the public forum, no matter what the artist may have intended with a lyric, it's then open to whoever listens to its interpretation. Which is the case, actually, Toby, if you look at the way that you've interpreted things. But we all do that, and it's open to that. So, and that can make a song political in a way that maybe the artist hadn't even thought of.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's that. And again, this is political in and of itself, the sort of democratic power of the public, of the mass consumers. They're not just passive. They have to make a decision that something resonates with them. Otherwise it's unheard. It doesn't really matter whether it's political or not political. So it's that combination of whatever the artist produced and the sort of recognition of its resonance by the public that is both political and so powerful. And as you say, then the public can do all sorts of things with that was not necessarily intended.
And we see them doing that with memes, and we see them doing it with GIFs and whatever. We see reinterpretation of songs and lyrics and imagery, all of which takes place to bring a different meaning. I mean, that's one of the things we can do now with the facilities that we have, the technology we have to actually tamper with artists' work and bring different interpretations to it.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I mean, it's hard to keep up with. I think somebody younger could write a really interesting book about, maybe even just focusing on one thing, the way that the sort of the recuration that went on first, I think amongst the millennial generation, that was more just like, we're going to have this, and this from the past. We're not going to bother with that, and that. So there's like oldsters like ourselves, like it or not. There are, the sort of what's been remembered and what's been forgotten. And when you look at something like the Spotify top 5 or 10, we're not in control of that, and often it's quite surprising, what is big and what's not. And that in itself, I think, is very interesting, and that shows that culture is, even old culture, is constantly evolving through that power of that democratic power of the public. I'm trying to avoid using the word consumer. And then Generation Z have done something even more interesting. Like you say, via TikTok, by recontextualizing things in different ways, like memes, TikTok, sort of dance routines, blah blah blah. They've completely, and they've grabbed quite random things from the past, given it completely new meanings, and given it a huge diffusion. I mean, it's hard for those of us who aren't in that world to keep on top of that. And I'm often aware of the fact that a song I may think has a certain resonance, has been, in the meantime, like, become this like viral TikTok sensation to actually mean something completely different. That I'm probably locked out of culturally, because I'm not 21.
Graham,
what's great about mixing pop and politics is that most music critics are not in their 20s or 30s; they're older, and they all write for Uncut and Mojo, which I buy all the time. But it really cheeses me off that the underlying tone of every article is that the greatest era was the 60s, then maybe the 70s, then maybe a bit of the 80s and a bit of the 90s, possibly Britpop. And apart from that, it's tumbleweed. Nothing else they write about they take properly seriously. Whereas your book ends up by saying that music's continued to develop since the 1990s, and you show that it's just as interesting now as it was before. But you see, it doesn't move quite as fast. Culture in music does not change as quickly as it did in the 1960s, which is why the 60s were such a special decade.
I think that's entirely true. And I think that sometimes older listeners can be a bit under reflective about that. When I quite often have people, my older audience members at my talks will sometimes say, something like, the music of the 60s was so innovative and it was so optimistic, and everything since has sounded like more sort of tired and repetitive and pessimistic. And I will go, do you think there might be an economic, / political reason for that? Do you think the fact that, people were living through a boom, and there was full employment and good welfare provision, and, and socially liberal legislation happening virtually weekly, I think that might have enabled some of that went on? And do you not think it's been a lot harder, since to keep on top of that stuff, even to afford to be a musician? It's become harder and harder. So,
My theory is that if the Kingsmen came along now as 22-year-olds, dressed like 22-year-olds, and did Louis Louis, music critics and guys in their 50s and 60s would say it was rubbish. It's just a repetitive riff. The lyrics are stupid, and they just write it off as modern crap. Whereas because it's from the 60s, Louis Louis is a classic by definition.
No, it's very interesting. So there's the massive sort of disjuncture between how, a lot of critics and including to a certain extent myself felt, though I've tried to keep an open mind. And then it's very sobering when you go and talk to younger audiences, because millennials don't give a toss about the 60s. And Gen Z give even less of a toss about the 60s. It's very humbling. It's like, if you thought the 60s were the greatest decade ever, and there are political reasons for that. Some of that's to do with resentment about the fact they feel that, boomers have used up all the world's resources and stuff, But also they're just not that bothered about the culture. Maybe it's just too long. But I was going to say, you'd think it was too long ago, but it's actually not, because they're very interested in the early 60s, and some of them are quite interested in the 50s. It's just the 60s, just don't have that kind of magic wand effect. So it's very interesting, that polarization.
I wondered, Toby, if you were to change the title to Mixing Pop and Politics, a Tory History of Popular Music, how that would contrast.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem there would be that a Tory or conservative approach to it would probably deny that anything apart from the overtly political was political. It would probably want to restore that sense of the aesthetic is in a separate realm. Sometimes just about what they seem to be. Don't spend so much time sort of like digging so deep because, there's this whole notion that that the left kind of like read too much into things and like spend too long kind of like sort of trying to look at this sort of show the skeletons of things. So I wonder if that would be that might be a rather short book, might be rather easier to write.
I would say Brit Awards, Tory pop, Mercury Music Prize, Marxist philosophy. There we go. Graham.
I think we're about to wrap this up, but we could talk to Toby all night and it would be entertaining, but it would sort of ruin the podcast. But we've got to say that mixing pop and politics is an entertaining read. Even though it's the result of deep thought at all times, it rushes through at top speed. It's a breezy book. So I wouldn't want to put anybody off reading this. It's as enjoyable a read as anything by Simon Reynolds or John Savage or any of the holy canon of music critics.
And in fact, I have to say here, my book is actually shorter than most of the books that Simon Reynolds and John Savage. I just waded my way through John Savage's latest book, and Simon Reynolds rarely writes a book under 600 pages long. So, I mean, I one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing as a writer is trying to like really make things jump off the page. It's like you kind of want to use your research, but you don't want it to just like, bring everything down to a sort of flat level. So I'm really trying to paint a picture of each era that I cover, and so the other intention was that you can dip into any chapter in this book. You don't have to read the introduction. You don't have to bother with the theory. You don't have to like read it at a sitting. It's just like you can read any era that you're interested in. And I hopefully it will sort of come alive and sort of, bring that sort of era kind of into sort of vivid sort of technicolor, but give it a very particular framing at the same time without making it seem completely like, what? That's not the 60s. I think that's what I'm quite.
Yeah, you're right.
It's not recognizably the 60s, but I'm not talking about it in exactly the same way that everybody else does,
The book works at every level on different levels successfully. And that's a sign of a great book.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Splendid. Well, Toby, we thank you for your time this evening. We do appreciate you joining us here on Two Big Egos in a Small Car. And are you doing any talks coming up in the Yorkshire area at all, Toby?
Well, I mean, Graham met me at the Harrogate one, so I think I've done Harrogate and Leeds. So I think I've probably
done and dusted. Yes.
Yeah, I don't want to exhaust my Yorkshire fan base. It's
like a touring international band. He only plays London and Glasgow.
Yeah. I am open to all offers. In fact, I there is still some possibility that something might happen in Leeds, actually. So,
okay, good.
That'd be good.
Well, we'll look out for that. And Toby, thank you so much for tonight. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Toby.
Cheers. So, Graham, thank you for Toby for a fascinating subject. It really is. And so we look forward to hopefully maybe a return to Leeds or wherever where Toby could give a talk. So Graham, a couple of other topics for tonight. You've been down to the launch of what was one of the most significant book events, of course, of the year, which, well, you better give it its correct title, The Old Peculiar.
No, it's Brixton Old Peculiar Crime Writing Festival, held in Harrogate for the last 22 years in July, for 4 action-packed days of top crime authors, talks, debates, workshops, and all very entertaining and informal and a little bit drunken as well, has to be said. On the fringes.
That's good, but launched in London, Graham.
Yeah, because it relies entirely on the big publishing houses.
Right.
And also, it's the most important crime writing festival in Europe, if not the world.
Yeah.
So London is the place to hold it because it proves that it's an important event.
Now, you met not someone who is noted, I think, as a crime writer. There are people who are such polymaths these days, but you met Julian Lloyd Webber. How come?
Well, he's the vice president of Harrogate National Festivals, who organised the Brixton Old Peculiar Crime Writing Festival. So he was there with his very nice wife, and I had quite a long chat with both of them, which was really enjoyable. But I've either excelled myself or I've gone too far. But Julian started talking about how he was currently writing his autobiography, and he was quite a way through it. So obviously, started talking about my biography. I'm writing of Fitzsimmons Magna Carta.
Of course you did.
Like it was on the same, like we're both in the same wavelength. And then he explained that he hadn't done it. He hadn't written a diary between about 2010 and COVID lockdown, whereas before he had, loads of diaries. So when he came to write his autobiography, he's got like a missing 10 years or so, where he hasn't got the dates of anything he did. He can obviously remember the highlights, but he doesn't know exactly when. And I said, I thought, I'll give him more advice because surely I'm the man to advise Julian Lloyd Webber, world famous musician, conductor, cellist. I'm surely the man to advise him how to write a book.
Of course.
I said, just go on what your feelings were for the things that mattered at the time and be honest and explain that the modern digital world had the effect of you not doing a diary and make an asset of it rather than like try to pretend that you remember every single day.
How did he react to what I thought was excellent advice?
He seemed to be all right with it. You can never quite tell because, it's such a sort of launch party soiree. Everybody wants to be nice because it's supposed to be a positive occasion. But he seemed to think it was all right. He didn't sort of like make some excuse and rush off.
Well, I mean, I think it's logical that if you've not written things down, what you do with your brain is to think of what stood out, and that's actually are the things that matter most. I always feel this. From any interview that I do, the first reaction is what are the things that struck me most? And that's how I largely construct an article.
Yeah, the dates and the facts are the skeleton, but they're not the flesh.
No.
The flesh is feelings.
Graham, 100% in an autobiography, that has to be the case.
Exactly. So I feel that I mean, you can never quite tell, but I don't think I put my foot in it, but you never know.
Well, I'm disappointed in some ways because I do like it when it goes wrong. There's always funnier tales in some ways. But anyway, so we'll know that if he resigns from his post and he refuses to ever come back to Harrogate, we'll know that you had a terrible impact on him and he never wanted to see you again.
Well, his charming wife, who's his fourth wife,
yes,
which I'd forgotten, and she's a world-class cellist as well.
Yeah,
I had a good chat with her, really nice, but sadly on that one I may have strayed into the wrong topic because forgetting that she was his fourth wife, I talked about the secrets of a long marriage, which may have been the wrong topic of conversation.
That's more like it, Graham. Now, I've no idea how long we've got left. Is there any indication from Anthony?
I would say a couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes. Okay, well, in that time, Graham, this is a group that I've not heard of. This is a very briefest subject. They're from London and they're called Fat Dog. Did you see them while you were in London?
No. I've got their album Woof that came out last year. Only 9 tracks, action-packed. A bit like The Prodigy had remixed Carter and Stubble Sex Machine and then got Trevor Horn to do a Frankie Goes to Hollywood production number on it as well. It's like in your face. It's loud and brash and combines synths and guitars and a bit of rap. And it's got soundtrack narration like it was Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds. And it's all about the modern world and what a mess it is and how hard it is to like do the right thing because it's all a mess. And it's right in your face. And it's way more lively than the Sprints or Wonder Horse or English Teacher or even The Last Dinner Party. And they were a huge hit at BBC Six Music's Festival in Liverpool last week. They went down a storm because supposedly Fat Dog are phenomenal live. And I thought, this is my favourite band of
You've been listening to the podcast Two Big Egos in a Small Car. Your hosts were Graham Chalmers and Charles Hutchinson. This was a Baltic sub-production.